Today is a familiar text from the previous few weeks. I assume that so many of you are here to get it memorized and down with confidence. Hear now the word of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 12, verses 1 through 11. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be ignorant. You know that when you were Gentiles, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one, speaking by the Spirit of God, ever says, "Let Jesus be cursed," and no one can say, "Jesus is Lord," except by the Holy Spirit. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of services, but the same Lord, and there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, and to another the workings of powerful deeds, to another prophecy, to another the discernment of spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This week, we will look at the spiritual gifts of discerning spirits. Now, if you had your hopes up for talking about exorcisms, I'm sorry to disappoint you. There is a Greek word for malevolent, mischievous, or evil spirits. That is not the spirits mentioned in this portion of our text. If you like that sort of thing, the Gospel of Mark is jam-packed full of it. There's also some very good material in Acts of the Apostles. But today we'll look at the discernment of other types of spirits. You may have also noticed in kind of the hymnody or the music of the church is a lot of this section happens to be in a part of stewardship and dedication to assuage your fears. No, this is not going to be a stewardship sermon. I'm trying to maintain that during this entire series. But it is something that we need to look at. Now, some of us are blessed with the discerning another person's spirit. These folks have intuition. They can perceive character. At our final gathering of our Bible study, one of us made a confession when we were having dinner over at Kathy Roberts, and they said that they are too trusting, that a person can say anything and I will believe them, which is part of the thesis of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. I mentioned a portion of this with regard to kind of the political realm. Winston Churchill in the last century was a backbench minister of parliament, seen as an up-and-comer in his youth, and he was discredited by the 1930s. Yet he accurately perceived the warlike and untrustworthy spirit behind the facade of a certain German chancellor of Germany with a Charlie Chaplin mustache. And he was later brought to the forefront as the prime minister. Now, in the book and in kind of the perceiving and talking to strangers, and also in modern culture, we think of the leader of the German National Socialists today as clearly a villain, a murderous character. The mustache and the red armband seemed clearly devilish. But back in the day, diplomats who actually met with that chancellor, they may have detested his politics, his rhetoric. But for the most part, that chancellor was able to pull the wool over their eyes, so much so that some officials even came back and said, well, he's not that bad of a chap. It turns out many were fooled, but not Winston Churchill, who, as Gladwell points out, did not judge by what the leader of the National Socialists said to foreigners, but what he said and did to his own people. We forget that the first and longest suffering victims of National Socialists were the German people, both Jews and Gentiles. And I would like to say that discerning spirits is a skill that can be taught, that can be picked up. In fact, it kind of deals more with art and intuition. And talking to strangers, Malcolm Gladwell says that we are hardwired to be a trusting people. We are all the descendants of people that worked together to survive the winter, endure persecution, and exclude those who thought only of themselves. The worst sentence in the ancient world was shunning or exile because it meant living alone. It meant living without community. It meant living without support. And we also have to realize that sometimes we are trusting or maybe too trusting of our in-group. In the early 2000s, Bernie Madoff, kind of the fraudster, ran a Ponzi scheme. And for years, he stole predominantly from his own people of faith, whether it was Steven Spielberg or other Jewish leaders. But he was also so secretive that his own kids, who he had employed in this grift for over 20 years, had no idea what their dad really did. And this brings up the fact that we are naturally trusting, especially people who are used to being in a giving community. There is a reason why scammers go after church folks. Every few months we send out reminders. In addition, as Christian folks, we forget that the whole world is not like us. Some cultures do not have the same sense of charity as we do. Likewise, some of the hardest parts of the Bible, when you get deep into either adult Sunday school or maybe when we were kids, was when we noticed with a little bit of experience that Abraham and Sarah scammed treasure and slaves out of Pharaoh. Likewise, Jacob and Rachel deceived their fathers and stole from their siblings. And these were people of faith, and yet we were also confused because it did not add up to the same morality that we were being taught. Since we have difficulty talking to strangers, it becomes important to interview people properly. It is also a good idea to look at their overall character and maybe not just the character in a certain part of their life. My home church had sponsored a Head Start in Little Liberty, Missouri, which when I moved there was a sleepy county seat in college town. And over the few decades, it grew into one of the bigger suburbs of Kansas City. And with part of the growing pains and the dramatic growth is much of the town had moved away from downtown, where our First Presbyterian Church had hosted a Head Start for over 30 years. Since Head Start outgrew its space, the town grew dramatically away, and they wanted to be closer to the interstate exits. Well, the Head Start program left. And so our church in the 1990s did not know quite what to do. We had just called a new pastor who had 3 kids, one of which needed to start preschool. So they decided that, well, we could run our own preschool. It would be simple. Half of the Head Start stuff was donated by us anyways. And they went looking around for people who could help out, which oddly enough, one of the people they picked was my dad. In the session, kind of got my dad on a committee, and they, kind of picked him because he had been a child psychologist. He had also ran the nonprofit board, which the local elementary after-school program, Latchkey, he brought that from a nonprofit into or under the umbrella of the school district. And they figured he could help them out, which he pointed out when it was time to interview, and he held some of the interviews or kind of sat in the corner. And one thing he did do is he told which of these directors under no circumstance that they should hire, which promptly they ignored his advice and, of course, hired that person. Thankfully, though, this is not a story about abuse, but my father had correctly read that the director's spirit was not in ministry. She had gifts for kids. She was great with children. She could form kind of small groups and do a lot of good things, but he knew at her heart she was not in it for the ministry. She was in it for herself. Likewise, he deduced that also her gift was not in administration. And it was interesting because over kind of the year, some of the folks were mentioning it's like odd that these new kids are all coming from the next town over. And they were interesting in saying, a lot of the neighborhood kids are no longer involved like they had been in the Head Start program. And it wasn't soon afterward that we heard that our director had started her own for-profit childcare in the next town, which was soon closed due to mismanagement. Of course, my dad brought this incident up every time they were looking for an elder at my home church. It was interesting when I get ordained, as we do with all ordination, we bring up our elders and our deacons to lay on their hands. And in this small church in Missouri, my dad was just kind of sitting there. And I could tell in his mind, he was sitting there and saying, I know exactly why I'm not up there with everybody else. My dad always kind of held that grudge. But it is important to tell or discern the spirits of our leaders. Often this can be a communal process in the Presbyterian tradition. We are forced to work together. I, as a pastor, cannot just go up and hire folks, appoint people to things. We have a nominating committee to do that, which we will meet as a congregation in September to appoint a new nominating committee. So get ready for the phone calls and awkward conversations. But we select a group of people to discern what gifts and talents are necessary for our current leadership needs. As pastor, I've sat on plenty of these in different churches. And one of the things that I have kind of learned over my time, one of the few things that is very general, is that when we have a board of deacons, you actually need to have someone that says no. And I learned this and had a great example in my first call in Missouri. At one church, her name was Carolyn. She was a former teacher. She was the wife of the superintendent. She was one of our money counters after church. And if it weren't for her, our deacons would literally give away our money at the very first month of the year. By March, we'd be completely out of money. Because Carolyn's job was to sit there and say, no, we can do more good for more people if we treat this like a marathon. One of the things we also learned, which oddly enough, later one of the nominating committees is like, later said, it's just like, oh, I picked Carolyn because she has a playful spirit. And I sat there, being like 3 or 4 deacons meeting in, and it's just like, Carolyn just says no. That's kind of what she's there for. She's not very playful. And then, since Ash Wednesday was a little bit later that year, and our deacons helped set up communion. It was funny is when I walked into the church getting ready for our evening service, and there was Carolyn, and she was pumped up. She was saying it was hump day, and she was kind of giving her timeless office jokes on the one Wednesday where they did communion. And it was interesting because she kind of brought that later on, because I think the next deacon meeting we were deciding that we were going to do a different direction. We were going to care a little bit more for the people who couldn't make it to church. And Carolyn decided that she was going to share one of her deacon calls. And at first, especially those who weren't there for Ash Wednesday to see kind of Carolyn's playful spirit, they were wondering, what is dry Carolyn? Is she, kind of a little bit, nervous or whatever? And she started to tell this story. And she called up one of the gals who hadn't been to church for a while. And on the other line, this gal, our more senior citizen, said, is this about attendance and money and me not coming to church? And Carolyn said, do you want this call to be about that? And our one of God's oldest friends said, no, I don't think we need to talk about that. I think I just need to tell you that God wakes me up afternoon, so if you do church afternoon, I'll go to church. And it was interesting because since Carolyn was always there and counted the money, she would soon make her deacon calls after church, because by that time it was afternoon, and she would have a great conversation. Likewise, when it came time for home communion, we said, well, since we only do it quarterly, why don't we delay it an hour? And then we always knew, since she lived just a block away from the church, we would make her the last visit. And sure enough, when we did home communion once every quarter, she would be our last person, and it would be way after noon, and she'd be dressed in the nines and have communion with us. When this parishioner moved to the nursing home, I knew to visit her in the afternoon. And if Carolyn hadn't had a dry, playful sense of humor, we would not have connected as well in the last couple years of this member's life. One of the things we don't talk about that much is discerning the spirit of the age. Sometimes we feel this is especially hard in our current time. We are so divided at the edges of our society that it seems like we are pulling apart, that our center is not holding. This was also kind of the feeling in the early 20th century. In poetry, we could see this, especially if we took a Brit Lit class. If you read anything by Thomas Hardy, anything after 1900, he's worried about change or a world war. W.B. Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, was kind of a sign for all of us in British literature. And it shows up in kind of the culture of the time. One of the magazines that started out and boldly said this would be a Christian century. Likewise, in the academic world, professor and publisher W.B. Du Bois famously said in The Souls of Black Folks that the problem of the 20th century would be the color line. Thankfully, the spirit of change, the spirit of equality, would be championed by the church in the 20th century. In fact, if it were not for the unity of the Christian culture and values, the great hurdles of that century would not have been jumped over. Now, sometimes we play down the militancy of our Christianity. Maybe if you noticed in our new hymnals, Onward Christian Soldiers did not make an appearance once again. In fact, the last time Onward Christian Soldier was in a Presbyterian hymnals, it was the 1950s. But to give us kind of an idea or the spirit of that age, Eisenhower's book about World War II was entitled Crusade in Europe. One of the reasons I feel that we don't include that hymn anymore is because the civil rights movement was so successful. The 20th century contained many of the deadliest wars. It was interesting to see if maybe that deadliness, if that spirit of unrest would affect us. Yet, as we saw during that time, there was not a civil war in this country. Christian values and commitment to non-violence raised up and was able to touch that spirit of the age. And we were able to change the world around us. It could also only have been done in that time. We were united as a nation. Our Christian values in the church had the right leadership, and the spirit that we had the spirit and a certain urgency that we could not kick the can down the road. This 21st century, it's a bit harder to tell what the spirit of this age is. We also admit that the church is a bit diminished, our culture and our prominence. The two big movements after the crash of 2008, the recession, were kind of the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement, both of whose adherents both got some political power. And strangely, the deficits and corporations got bigger, which were kind of the main issues that these two were fighting for, and the opposite thing happened. Part of the problem behind these groups were we didn't hear about them, but we didn't hear about them too much, is that they had very large rallies, and both sides are mad as hell and weren't going to take it. But that was about it. In the end, there was no substance, no leadership, no coherent values behind, and there were no true demands. In the 20th centuries, the big movements had demands. That the laws of the land not create artificial separation of those made in God's image. That we might as well have codified Paul's letter to the church 19 centuries before. And the demands were also realistic. At that time, we did not ask people not to sin. We knew that was an unreasonable demand. People are always going to sin. The world is full of sin. We just didn't want it to be part of our laws of this land. And so this century, We've had popular movements similar or report to be in the tradition of the great Christian movements of the 20th century, and they have not gotten off the ground, often because of their demands. It is not realistic to make great change and reordering of life when their demands are don't argue and do what I say. This was not realistic. And we'll see maybe in the future as something else rises up, if the spirit of the age can be properly discerned and enacted. Paul, in his letter to the church, he has some demands of us. He is saying those gifts, those talents that we have been given, they are for a purpose, that each and every one of us is gifted, that we who are baptized, we are demanded to use our God-given gifts to build up the church and prepare the world for the kingdom of God. And the Spirit calls us to activity, that we are not to squirrel away our gifts for self-gain, but to use these gifts, we need to know what they are and how to use them. So we will move down this list in the next 2 weeks. In fact, next week we'll be talking about tongues and discernment of tongues. But we also need to know that these gifts are there to build up and not to destroy. So this is a time and a place where we need to discern where God's Spirit is moving. That's why we have the prayers of the people. We need to see where people need aid. We need to see what people are doing. What griefs are people holding? What joys are they celebrating? And is God's Spirit in that? And do we have the gifts to meet those needs? And if we don't, perhaps our neighbor does. And perhaps if we know our neighbor, we can know how they can serve God in this place as we discern what the Spirit is doing.